and stakeholder groups to identify what we know, what we don't know, and what research in other regions of the country can be applied to better understand ocean acidification and its impacts here in the southeastern United States. With awareness of and access to the research and its applications and uses, webinar participants will be able to collaborate to better understand and adapt to ocean acidification moving forward. I'm Paula Keener. I'm a marine biologist and I'm Director of Education for the NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, and I'm a member of the SOCAN Steering Committee. And I'll be moderating today's session on behalf of the SOCAN Steering Committee. Jen Bennett-Mintz is Education and Outreach Coordinator for NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and Jen is also on the line with us, and she'll be helping to facilitate today's session as well. During the presentation, all audience members will be in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type questions related to technical issues you may have or questions for the panelists into the questions box at the bottom of the GoToMeeting control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. Jen will be monitoring these incoming questions, and after all the panelists share their perspectives, we will move to these questions that were posted to the public by us over the last week, and then we'll take the questions that have been entered into the GoToMeeting panel by you all. We are also recording this session, and the video recording and the PDF of the presentation will be available on the SOCAN website shortly. We are very excited to have panelists today representing 4 different stakeholder groups: the Ocean Acidification Research Group, Fisheries Science, Natural Resource Management, and the industry. Brian Hopkinson is our first panelist, and Brian is with the University of Georgia, and he will be offering the ocean acidification science perspective. Brian grew up outside of Richmond, Virginia, and studied chemistry at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Pursuing his interest in environmental science, Brian continued graduate work in oceanography at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, part of the University of California, San Diego. There he studied the marine chemistry and biology of iron, a limiting nutrient in large parts of the ocean. Brian then went on to Princeton University as postdoc, where he investigated the effects of rising CO2 on marine phytoplankton, a project that evolved into a detailed study on the physiology of inorganic carbon processing in marine algae. Brian has continued and expanded this work as an assistant professor at the University of Georgia, attempting to understand the physiological mechanisms that underlie the response of marine algae and corals. Brian will be followed by Patrick Geer, who will be sharing with us the fisheries science perspective. Pat has been the Chief of Marine Fisheries for the Coastal Resources Division for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources since 2010. Prior to becoming Chief, Patrick ran the department's Marine Fisheries Research Unit and was a marine scientist at the College of William and Mary, where he managed the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences Trawl Survey and Fisheries GIS. He is an active member of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries, South Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission, the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, the Governor's South Atlantic Alliance, and Grays Reef National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council and Research Advisory Panel. His interests include decapod population dynamics, fishery resource management, survey design, fisheries climatology, and habitat restoration. Patrick received his master's from Old Dominion University in biological oceanography. Patrick will be followed by Holly Greening, who will be sharing insight about ocean acidification and natural resource management. Holly earned a master's from Florida State University following extensive estuarine food web studies. Her professional career has focused on managing watershed and estuarine projects. As Executive Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Holly is responsible for maintaining the strong partnership forged through that program, continuing the Bay's science-based restoration and recovery strategies. Holly has served on the Estuarine Research Federation Governing Board, the National Academy of Sciences Ocean Studies Board, 4 National Research Council committees, and is co-chair of the 2011 Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation Conference, and is chair of the Association of National Estuary Programs. And Holly is associate editor for the scientific journal Estuaries and Coast. She is currently serving on the Florida Oceans and Coastal Council and the National Work Group for Blue Carbon. Last but not least, Curtis Himmel will be offering the perspective from industry today. Curtis is the founder and managing director of Bay Shellfish Company located in Terracea, Florida, which had its beginnings in 1996 as Florida's first clam hatchery. Bay Shellfish now produces marine bivalve seeds for research, restoration, and commercial aquaculture, and is the largest bivalve hatchery in the southeastern U.S., with the largest diversity of species. In 2003, Curtis and his team began a division dedicated to hatchery and nursery design, construction, training, and consulting. It is a U.S. leader in flow-through technology designs, including the CCAP's continuous algae system. Current projects at the hatchery include oyster disease testing, on-bottom oyster culture techniques, water chemistry research on larval development, multiple new species projects, a new platform microalgae systems design, and nutraceutical-based algal research. We will start with Brian, and he will share a bit about ocean acidification science as it relates to Georgia and Florida. So take it away, Brian.
All right, thanks for having me on. And the truth is, it's not going to be too much about Georgia and Florida. I'm sort of going to give you what I know about, sort of the general effects of ocean acidification on marine organisms, those sort of the direct effects on organisms. Just so we're all on the same page, I was going to talk about a little bit about the chemistry as well. So most of this is probably familiar to everyone listening here, but as CO2 rises in the atmosphere, as shown here in this red record of CO2 from Mauna Loa in Hawaii, a large portion of that CO2 dissolves in the ocean, raising the oceanic CO2 concentration. In water, CO2 reacts with water to form bicarbonate and a proton. The proton is effectively acid, and that causes the pH of the ocean to drop. Over this fairly short historical record shown here in the blue, light blue data, it's been a modest drop in pH over time, but if you project out to year 2100, if CO2 concentrations reach, say, 1,000 ppm, the pH of the ocean will drop on average to about 7.7 from pre-industrial levels of 8.2, which is a substantial drop. Again, pH is a logarithmic scale. Now, all organisms will have to deal with that drop in pH. It's important for, essentially all marine organisms to maintain a fairly constant internal pH, since essentially all enzymatic reactions are pH dependent. So if pH changes, even just a little bit from the normal internal set point, that would have really serious metabolic consequences. So on the right here is just kind of a generic plot of internal pH of any particular organism. I've shown a fish here, but you could think of almost any organism. Internal pH on the y-axis and seawater pH on the x-axis. And really the important thing here is just that there's this broad region of seawater pH where the organism works to maintain a constant internal pH. Of course, there is some range outside which it can't manage to do that, and homeostasis is lost. But we don't expect that, for most organisms anyways, as the extent to which pH will drop into, say, year 2100 down to 7.7 or so, that really won't go outside this homeostatic bound. So the organisms, to a large extent, will be able to maintain their internal pH, but they have to take certain actions to do that to maintain acid-base balance. And in fish, for example, that generally involves accumulating bicarbonate and other counterions to counter that decline in pH outside of their body. So it's, in fact, not so much the change in pH inside the organism that will have an effect, but these compensatory actions they take to counter the changes in pH. So, for example, in fish, there's a lot of behavioral and neural changes that have been noted that are thought to be due to the accumulation of bicarbonate and other ions like sodium and potassium that occur as effect of ocean acidification. So just kind of generally, we think that almost all organisms will take some take some action to offset changes in pH that are occurring outside. The extent to which that affects their metabolism or growth varies a lot organism to organism, but there is potential for that to affect them. There's also other chemical changes that accompany ocean, the declining pH that goes with the rising CO2 concentrations. And what I'm showing in this somewhat complicated plot here is that as CO2 in the atmosphere rises and that CO2 dissolves in seawater, that will of course lead to a rise in CO2 concentrations in seawater, but it will also lead to a drop in carbonate concentrations. Here it's shown in blue. And the reason that's relevant is that organisms use CO2 for photosynthesis, at least photosynthetic organisms do, and certain organisms use the carbonate to form calcium carbonate hard parts. So for example, the skeletons of corals, the shells of mollusks, and many other organisms make their hard parts out of calcium carbonate minerals. So one of the most well-known effects of ocean acidification is that in general, calcification rates, that is the formation of these calcium carbonate minerals, will decline. I'm showing an example here for a coral where newly settled polyps of this coral will grow under progressively more acidic conditions, so lower carbonate concentrations. And you can see that less calcium carbonate was formed. So this will have effects on the growth and success of these organisms. Not all organisms are as dramatically affected as corals, but ultimately, if CO2 concentration is very high, it will cause dissolution of calcium carbonate structures. On the other hand, photosynthetic organisms like phytoplankton and seagrasses may in fact benefit from the higher CO2 concentrations. Those benefits are generally fairly modest. So here on the left are some results from experiments on phytoplankton. These are kind of old experiments, but they show generally what's been found, that as CO2 concentrations increase from something close to pre-industrial levels to year 2100 levels, photosynthetic and growth rates might rise up to 20% or so. Some organisms are not affected at all, but others increase their growth and photosynthetic rates moderately. There are a few organisms that are more strongly affected, like this nitrogen-fixing Cyanobacterium trichodesmium, but in general, the effects are fairly modest. So these are kind of just a very broad overview of the direct effects of ocean acidification on marine organisms. There will, of course, likely be indirect effects, food web effects, that is, if say a calcifying algae is critical for the early life stages of a larval fish. If that calcifying algae can't live as well under acidified conditions, that might affect the success of that fish. But those kind of food web effects are, in general, very difficult to predict, I would say. So that's just kind of a very broad overview of the effects of ocean acidification on marine organisms. And I can turn it over to the next speaker whenever.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that information. That was very informative. So next, we would like to go to Patrick Gear. So Patrick.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yes, Patrick. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's get this. I got my screen. Get this down. All right. Thanks for having me today. I have to admit, I really haven't delved much into ocean acidification. However, from looking at the literature, I can see how it can have some major impacts to some of the southeast fisheries. And these are some of the important southeast commercial fisheries that may be impacted by lower pH. You'll notice right away that they're all invertebrates. About 57% of the region's commercial harvest comes from decapod crustacean, crabs, shrimps, and lobsters, and mollusks such as whelk clams and oysters. The three species of Panea shrimp, white, brown, and pink, along with blue crab, account for well over half the entire region's annual seafood harvest. And this is just an annual average landings by state from 2009 to 2013, and I've highlighted the invertebrates in gray. You can see the blue crab and Penaeid shrimp are always near the top for each state. And since I am a decapod biologist by trade, I was going to try to concentrate on them today. Penaeid shrimp harvest is typically always first or second in pounds landing in the southeast, and it's always first in value. Landings for the region remain remarkably stable for over 60 years, with the 20-year average about 20 million pounds, with North Carolina typically having the highest percentage of the catch, about 30%, and the other 3 states about equally split. Landings have declined over the past 20 years, probably due mostly to reduction in effort. We've seen reduction in the number of trips and as well as the licensed vessels in the fleet in general. The stability of this fishery is also shown in the various state fisheries independence surveys like the one we have at Georgia DNR. This survey has been going on since 1976, and the long-term average hovers around 3 kilos per trawl. Recent declines that we've seen in 2011 and onward have been due to disease and excessive precipitation that have affected white shrimp. This is just the general life cycle of Penaeid shrimp. As you can see from this, it's the take-home message is that shrimp are a short-lived estuarine-dependent species that migrates to the ocean to mate and disperse their eggs, that develop through 4 larval phases, 7 molt stages that occur over 30 to 45 days. Moving on to blue crabs, over the past 20 years, blue crab harvest has been dominated by North Carolina, comprising about 75% of the catch. Blue crab harvest has not been as stable as in shrimp. Landings have declined steadily since the 1990s. It was first thought that this might be due to drought conditions that plagued the area from 98 to 2003, but those drought conditions have not prevailed over the past 10 years, and both landings and survey results have shown dramatic declines. The blue crab has a similar life cycle with offshore larval development with 2 larval phases and 8 molt stages, which occur over a longer period of time than shrimp, somewhere between 35 and 70 days before recruiting back into the estuary. Both larval stages of these species rely on a combination of wind, tides, and current to provide food through upwelling and to provide larval transport back to the estuaries. Just a little bit of primer from what I've read about mostly crustacean in ocean acidification. It affects calcifying organisms are more prone to it. Marine organisms typically are more at risk than estuarine species. Estuarine organisms are typically better osmoregulators and can better control their acid-base equilibrium than the marine species. However, other variables in the estuaries like highly variable and changing DOs and temperatures can aggravate the problem. Early life stages, eggs and larvae, are a particular concern. And there are several generalized impacts of lower pH that we should discuss, all of which have an interdependency within and potentially between the species. And dealing with this specifically with crustacean, there isn't a lot in the literature for species in the southeast, so we've had to rely on where a lot of the work has been done. Much of it has been done in higher latitudes with the American and European lobsters in the North Atlantic, and with the red king crab and the tanner crab in the Bering Sea. The impacts are not consistent among the phylum. There appears to be a general increase in calcification. Most studies either show a minimum effect or an increase, which produces a thicker shell. This has an energetic cost that has many repercussions. It creates a reduced condition index since energy is being used for osmoregulation instead of for growth. So if there's less growth, there's less meat, the fishery is worth less money. Growth is decreased. We see a longer period between molts. There's smaller growth increments, and there's prolonged period of ecdysis when they're in soft shell stage. And that's when they're the most vulnerable because they're preyed upon by virtually everything, and also there's a lot of cannibalism as well. Reproduction, if an animal is smaller because it's smaller growth, when it matures, it's going to be less fecund. There are going to be fewer offspring produced. Recruitment, I think, is a major issue because I think the larval stages of these species are probably the most vulnerable. and the eggs and larvae appear to have slower growth, and there's other factors involved with timing and disconnects with other food sources out in the ocean. Survivability and mortality just overall for all life stages. If they're smaller size, they could be more vulnerable to predators, and if they're smaller, predators may not be satiated. They may need to eat more. Like I said, there's not a lot in the southeast for some of these major fisheries. Most of the work has been done in the northern latitudes. So that's all I have at this point. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Holly Greening, a little perspective on resource management. Take it away, Holly.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today, and the management implications of ocean acidification for fisheries have been really well identified by both Brian and Patrick. But here in Tampa Bay, we have seen a very intriguing pattern that has caused us to question: can recovery in an estuary like Tampa Bay, including water quality improvements and seagrass recovery, assist in providing ocean acidification refugia in estuaries? And I think this is a real, very much of a management question that relates directly to how we work on improving our estuaries over time. In Tampa Bay in the 1970s, we had very serious impacts from nutrient enrichment from wastewater treatment plants as well as from stormwater. But due to a number of actions that started in about 1980, we've seen a reduction in our nitrogen load by over 50% in a relatively short period of time. And we're continuing to see a reduction in nitrogen load over time with improvements in both wastewater treatment facilities as well as over 500 projects, stormwater projects, reductions in atmospheric deposition from some of our power plants, reductions from agriculture and also from our industry here in Tampa Bay. So we're continuing to see reductions in nitrogen loading to the bay, even though we've seen more than 1 million people come into our bay since 1990. So that's we've seen a lot of recovery in terms of water quality and nutrient concentration as well as phytoplankton concentration in our bay waters. With that recovery of water quality, we've also seen much clearer water with the reduction in phytoplankton over time, and a very great recovery of seagrass. Between 1950 and 1990, we had lost about 50% of our seagrasses in Tampa Bay, over 20,000 acres. But with the reductions in nutrient loads, the increase in water clarity, we're now seeing an increase in seagrass. And in fact, just earlier this year, found that we have met our long-term goal of recovering 38,000 acres bay-wide. This is, again, I think a very important message for us in terms of, you know, the benefits of an improving estuary. One of the, again, very intriguing patterns that we have seen, we do have long-term water quality data at about 100 stations throughout Tampa Bay. And back during the eutrophic period, when we had excess nutrients coming into the bay, our pH was quite high during that time, reached a peak of about 8.4, 8.5. But then with the reductions in nutrients that happened starting in about 1980, we have seen the pH drop till about 1990, and then we're seeing what is a reversal of the pattern that we see globally, and that is a gradual rise in pH over time, with concurrently with the seagrass recovery. And so our question is whether the recovery of seagrass can also help to perhaps buffer some of the global changes in pH that we have seen over time. A really important piece of the Tampa Bay element here is that we have a lot of monitoring information that we can bring to bear here in terms of addressing this question of whether an improving estuary can also help with ocean acidification trends. A local water quality program conducted by the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County since 1972. Our other two counties in the area, as well as the cities, also have long-term water quality data, including pH and other metrics over time. We have a regional effort with a seagrass extent from the Southwest Florida Water Management District with aerial surveys every 2 years since 1982. We also have, at the state level, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission conducts at many random sites per year since 1990 mollusks, algae concentrations, and also fish. And at the federal level, USGS has been conducting sediment cores, so that we have all of these pieces of information that we can bring to bear to try to address some of the questions that we have. Some of the ongoing research, again, we're just starting on this now with USGS, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the Tampa Bay Estuary Program are examining the role of seagrass beds in elevating pH and carbonate mineral saturation state in Tampa Bay to try to get at that question is, you know, are the characteristics over seagrass beds or associated with seagrass beds in terms of pH and carbonate mineral saturation different than they are without the seagrass beds, and whether by increasing our seagrass beds we're also increasing our ability to buffer some of the longer-term trends in ocean acidification. It's very exciting work. I think it has an awful lot of implications for management of our estuaries by managing nutrient inputs. We've seen this improvement in the bay, and maybe a side effect which may be equally as important as the nutrient element is the potential for buffering ocean acidification trends. Very quick overview of what is happening here in Tampa Bay, and I'll turn it on over to Curtis.
Thank you, Holly. Curtis? Curtis, can you hear us?
Curtis, it looks as though you're muted, so if you could press that mute button once again so we could hear you, that would be great. So Paula, it actually looks up. There he goes. We lost Curtis for a moment, but it looks like he's getting back online. So if you just bear with us for another minute.
Hello.
Haha.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry about that. I was fashionably late, as they say.
That's it.
We're glad you're here, Curtis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'll begin. I'd like to say hello to everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel.
Curtis, sorry to interrupt. I think when we lost you for a moment, we lost the ability to share your screen. So if you could do that again, we can be able to see.
Okay. Let's see. Show my screen. Is that working?
There you go. Yes, it is.
Great.
Take it away.
Got it. Okay, again, hello to everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel because this is something that's in our industry ocean acidification has affected our industry in certain regions of the world, and it's something that we've kind of been ignoring in the southeast, and maybe we have good reason to ignore it. Maybe there's not an effect from ocean acidification, but maybe there is, and we honestly don't know. So, also I'd like to make a quick correction in case there's somebody listening that didn't agree with my bio. We were not the first clam hatchery in Florida, but we were one of the original hatcheries that developed with the industry almost 20 years ago. But moving forward, when I started research on looking at ocean acidification, based on what I just mentioned, I called all the other hatcheries, or as many as I could contact in the southeast region, and they felt the same way I did. They knew very little about it, about the subject, and had no idea if it had any effect on the animals they were producing. So that's our starting point in the southeast. But I also apologize if I didn't reach someone and they do know more than what I just mentioned. And if they do, they haven't shared it yet. So let's see. Defining the bivalve industry in the southeast U.S. That not all of the states in the southeast U.S. produce bivalves from an aquaculture standpoint, but the ones listed below do. In Louisiana, it's LSU, and that's mainly a research facility, although they do production for the commercial farmers and or the evolving oyster industry. Alabama is very similar. I believe they're just producing oysters and for an evolving aquaculture industry, along with research. In Florida, we have the largest amount of hatcheries. There are 5 on the west coast of Florida and 3 on the east coast of Florida. And most of those are private facilities, if not all. But and then in Georgia, we have one at, I believe, UGA, and then one in South Carolina, which is a private facility. Now, of those 3 hatcheries, of all those hatcheries in the southeastern region, they do production, as I mentioned, for research. Many of them do work for restoration purposes, and obviously commercial aquaculture is the largest segment of production. The question we have is, where is our regional industry, bivalve aquaculture, in regards to ocean acidification? What do we know? Have we done any testing? And what is planned? And as I've already alluded to, the answer is no, no, and nothing. And I don't mean that in regards to there aren't scientists at different universities and different organizations working on ocean acidification or looking at it, but I'm unfamiliar with any of them that are working directly with the bivalve aquaculture industry. Why should we look at ocean acidification in the bivalve industry? Well, it's been a defined problem with hatcheries in other regions. It certainly has a huge economic impact when you look at the wild take of oysters in the Gulf of Mexico and then add that to all of the aquacultured products done south of Virginia through to the Gulf of Mexico. Not only that, aside from that being in the hundreds of millions of dollars, the industry is in a rapid growth phase now, shifting from wild harvest, specifically in oysters, over to a more aquacultured product. And ocean acidification seems to affect bivalve larvae, which is the key to producing an aquacultured product. As the bottom mentions, it is one of our invertebrates and one of our sensitive organisms that could be considered a canary in the coal mine. We certainly think it's an important one to be looking at. Unknown diseases and mortality in bivalves, that's a tricky one. One of the reasons the bivalve industry was unaware of ocean acidification, and even in the areas where it's now been better defined, is that bivalve larvae are so sensitive that they're used by federal and testing organizations around the world against pollutants and other contaminants, along with mysid shrimp and other organisms. That inherent sensitivity makes them very difficult in the aquaculture field. And as we're well aware of, there are no perfect bivalve hatcheries anywhere on this planet. After 50 years, we know of none that have been created that have a turnkey operation. All of them are subject to water chemistry and water quality changes, and very, very slight changes that occur seem to cause mortality in those hatcheries, and it happens globally and on every continent. One of the things that led us to looking at ocean acidification, well, really what led hatcheries in the Pacific Northwest to look at ocean acidification was this very issue. They continually are trying to look at why their animals, their larvae, were dying, and they did extensive testing on bacteria and other pathogens, and every time they thought they had something figured out, something new would pop up and affect their production. Forward. So moving on to what those other regions of the world are doing. I put some calls into Europe, and some of the large hatcheries over there really weren't addressing the issue either. I'm sure that there are some that are addressing the issue, but I didn't find much in the literature in regards to applying research to the hatchery end, and that led me to the Pacific Northwest, which appears to be one of the leaders in this issue. Let me back up. What I found was bivalve producing areas that we see in the United States that are dealing with ocean acidification are the U.S. West Coast, and most of those hatcheries reside in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, although there are hatcheries in California that are also being affected. We see some research beginning in the Northeast, and that research seems to be slowly funneling down to Virginia, which is a large bivalve producing state. The most information I received when I was after being asked to sit on this panel was when I spoke to Bill Dewey at Taylor Seafood in Washington. They're one of the oldest hatcheries in the United States, and they're certainly one of the largest in the world. And this is an issue that really hit home to the hatcheries in that region. I don't have all the time frames, but they went through this same, well, and they still are. All hatcheries are still trying to figure out what causes mortality at different times of the year. But through that search, they thought many years ago they had recognized a certain bacteria, Vibrio tubiaceae, and they thought that that was the smoking gun. They thought they had it figured out. And the very next year they saw their mortalities increasing. And that's something we do see in the Southeast. Of the hatcheries that have been here, although they have not been around for much over 20 years, as the technology grows and our ability to produce bivalves, we did see an increase in efficiency and a decrease in mortality overall in seed production until just recently. In the last 2 years, we've seen more problems in bivalve hatcheries in the Southeast than, in other words, the trend is reversed. And that is a scary proposition for us and the other producers. During the last 10 years, we did look at the average water temperatures during a certain period when we saw mortalities based on a NOAA recording site. And we noticed that the average water temps during that period had been at all-time highs over the last 10 years, or at least 6 of the last 10 years. And so again, we don't know, how is that affecting possible ocean acidification or related interactions, or is it completely separate? But going back to the Pacific Northwest, Bill Dewey relayed his story in that as they were looking for answers and they figured out that the bacteria was certainly a problem, but it wasn't a smoking gun, and their hatcheries were seeing the same thing we are now. Over a period of time, the hatcheries became better and better at production, but all of a sudden, that trend reversed. And one scientist, he said, did propose and then ultimately prove that ocean acidification was the problem in the hatcheries. He developed that link, and upon doing so, they developed a monitoring system, which they told me was called the Berkolator, which I assume is named after the inventor of the device, which took multiple readings to come up with a level of aragonite saturation. Once they had that system of monitoring and were able to look at a certain level, they were able to come up with a treatment. And their treatment is, during those periods, they add sodium carbonate to the water that's coming into the hatcheries, and that seems to solve the problem. So this is an example of ocean acidification directly affecting bivalve production, and once they were able to monitor it or diagnose it, they were able to come up with a treatment and a solution. Now, sadly, they still do have mortality, and again, that wasn't a smoking gun either, but it was one of the things that was causing that trend to reverse and hatcheries to do worse than they had been doing over the previous 10, 20 years. Also of note that he relayed to me, and that I've seen in some of the research, and I think some of our panelists have hit on, ocean acidification may be affecting us in obvious other ways, including our industry, because our industry relies 100% on the production of live microalgae at hatcheries. And we have had increasing problems with microalgae culture, and that hasn't gotten better, though it seems like our technology has increased and things should be getting better. And specifically, our hatcheries had problems with diatoms over the last 2 years. And again, we wonder what effect ocean acidification might play. The last question is, what should we be doing? And I do not have an answer to that, but I would suggest that we look at the areas like the Pacific Northwest and try to use that, or steal a little bit from their playbook. And maybe we should start the process of monitoring in the same way that they're doing, to discover if we are having issues and if they are relating to the bivalve industry. That's it, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Curtis, and thank you each of the panel members for these great presentations. And what we're going to do right now is go to some of the questions that have come in over the past week in anticipation of the perspectives that you all have shared with us over the last half hour. And the first one that I'd like to start with is just generally, and we'll start with you, Brian. What do you think the larger community perspective is on ocean acidification in the Southeast region?
Well, I think some of the talks in this series have Wei-Jun Kai and Scott Noakes have touched on that. Ocean acidification was originally identified as more of an open ocean problem because the carbonate chemistry there is very predictable, very well understood. So the issues get a little more complicated when you get into coastal regions, because there are already biogeochemical processes that are changing pH and carbon chemistry in coastal regions, along with physical processes like river input, mixing of different seawaters, upwelling, things like that. So I guess my general perspective would be that even just the chemistry of ocean acidification gets more complicated when you're in the coastal region, and which is mostly what we're talking about here, relevant to fisheries and shellfish and things like that in the coastal regions. So you do have to, as the previous speaker mentioned, it really becomes important to look at the particular characteristics of the local environment that you're working in, and what are the pHs to begin with, how are those changing over time, do we understand the carbon chemistry of that system the way Holly was talking about they're trying to work out in the Tampa Bay estuary. So that would be my perspective on that.
Okay, thank you.
I guess the next thing to do would then be, you do start to, as Curtis said, not a lot of work has been done on the particular species in the southeast. And so, it might then be, if you find that the area you're working in is being affected by ocean acidification, you'd want to do some probably, fairly basic experiments to see does changing pH or CO2 affect the growth or other survival of larvae of the species you're interested in.
Right, exactly. And so I want to, you hit on an element of another question, so I'm going to follow up before I move to the other panelist, addressing the special cases that we deal with in the coastal regions. And one question deals with hypoxia. And I was wondering if you might comment on the combination of low oxygen and high CO2 in these regions and the potential effect that may have on some of the organisms that we have discussed.
Yes, so just in general, when you have low oxygen, you've already had a lot of respiration, which has produced a lot of CO2. So just chemically, that combination of low oxygen and higher CO2, initial CO2 in the water because of CO2 in the atmosphere, will kind of exacerbate that problem of ocean acidification. Then, of course, hypoxia, if we think about the organism's perspective, hypoxia is an additional stressor on top of the ocean acidification stressor. I have to confess I'm not too familiar with work looking at the interactions between those two, but you could just imagine that in general it's harder for organisms to deal with multiple stressors than it is for them to deal with one stressor. So I'm afraid I don't have
no, that's fine. That's fine. It's just, and also the CO2 levels are elevated in the coastal waters already. So it's an extra. So yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Patrick, do you have some perspectives to share with us about what your thoughts are on just the broader community perspective of ocean acidification?
We haven't really heard.
I mean, particularly.
Am I muted? No, I'm on. Okay. Really haven't heard too much, from the general public, at least in Georgia. At least in Georgia, we haven't had too much. We've discussed it internally in house. Obviously there can be major ramifications to the shellfish industry. The oyster and the clam industry, as Curtis already mentioned too. It's like I'm very interested in how we've seen this decline in blue crabs, not only in Georgia, but pretty much along the whole Atlantic coast. We've seen this decline, and it's not the normal, it can't be really contributed to overfishing or the normal environmental factors that we've seen, that we normally see. So it kind of raises the question about, should we be looking at, is pH affecting, blue crab abundance in some way? And, I'm really interested in that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Holly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think from the management community, as Brian mentioned, I think there's been more of a focus on sort of the open ocean changes in acidification, and also the coral reef obviously has been a very big element there. We're just starting, I think, in the coastal regions that don't have coral reefs or something very, very visible like that, to take a look at the potential for lowering pHs over the period. I think a real big issue in coastal regions is that there are not a lot of locations that actually have a long enough monitoring period of record for pH to understand whether our pH is going up or down over time. So finding enough long-term records and areas where those long-term records are, and examining the patterns, I think would be a really important next step. But it's the monitoring programs themselves, there are not very many of them around the United States and or in the Southeast that we have a long enough period of record to be able to detect a change in pH over time. So another plug for having long-term databases, or at least getting started on those. But I would have to agree with Brian and Pat that this is a relatively new issue in coastal management.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Audrey. All right, Curtis, can you share your thoughts on the community perspective with us?
Yes, I guess as I ended with my talk, the question for us is, a management perspective of industry is, what should we be doing? And, I think we simply need to look at what's being done elsewhere and start there. And the effects, in the Gulf may be very different. I'm being told by some scientists that I speak to that although ocean acidification started off as an open ocean issue, as was previously mentioned, and then it's in the Pacific Northwest, it's due to deep water upwellings. That's when the events occur. But yet some of the experts that I've spoken to said that, well, the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to find greater effects in shallower water. But then again, do we have systems that create more buffering? So I think it can be a very complex issue. So starting with, there was a scientist that's overseeing a large portion of the monitoring at the hatcheries up and down the West Coast. I don't have her name in front of me. She's with UC Davis in California. And, perhaps just beginning with some of the monitoring systems that they've already put, millions of dollars into research and development, here in the Southeast. And ideally it should be done somewhere where half of the experiments are already occurring, meaning the production of the animals is already occurring at our local hatcheries. Our hatchery, for instance, runs year-round. We produce anywhere from 4 to 6 different species per year. So, if we had monitoring on-site, continual monitoring, that might be something that we can relate directly to our production and or lack of production throughout the year. So I think that that might be a good start. And it is interesting that different animals are going to be affected in different ways, and it may be hard for us to totally define how those interactions occur, because I'm being told that one of the issues we may be looking at down here when I talk to other scientists are that we won't have deep upwelling ocean events that cause our ocean acidification problem. But it could be simply that different species of algae that perform better with the increased CO2 going into the seawater end up outcompeting traditional algae. Well, that could be affecting our production overall once animals go into the wild. But as huge algal blooms occur and they die off quickly, I'm told that post a large algal die-off, we could be looking at an ocean acidification issue. And if that's happening in near coastal or near shore waters, that could, the spawns that we do during that week may be affected by ocean acidification indirectly through, CO2 being brought into the water to the algae and then being released in a die-off and causing the water chemistry issues.
Right.
So, and then beyond that, obviously the responses of, these primary producers in our oceans to the interactions between all the other factors, solar radiation, the warming, two things that, certainly the warming we're seeing in our area of the world. So, well, I mean everywhere, but how are those interactions, as one of the previous speakers talked about, there are additional stressors too. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Curtis, this is a question just for you that has come in. For you on behalf of other industry members, would you be open to collaborative ocean acidification research and monitoring with scientists in the Southeast as a next step? And if so, what are your thoughts on those types of partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't speak for every hatchery in the Southeast, but like I said, many of them are already involved in research projects. Many of them are located at universities, so I think there's an opportunity throughout the Southeast. But we in particular, even as a private hatchery, we've focused our work on research, restoration, and commercial production. And since we run year-round, that may be a strong opportunity to do testing and research at our facility. Yep, we'd be open to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. This Holly brought this up in her description of the Tampa Bay area and the seagrass work that they're doing, the involvement of governments and other agencies in that work. But are any of you aware of any type of involvement in the Southeast or groups that are of that level that are looking at including ocean acidification in their marine conservation and or aquaculture planning processes at this point? And we'll start with Brian.
I probably am not the person to answer this question.
Okay.
I don't know too much about the planning process.
All right, Patrick, are you aware of anyone?
Yeah, I think the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council's Habitat Advisory Panel and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Habitat Committee both have habitat plans that I believe have some material in there on ocean acidification, but there isn't much, obviously. So, but I think it is. There's like a placeholder in those plans, I believe.
Do you know if any of that is being transferred up to the legislature?
Not that I know of.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Holly?
Yes, there is some work that is being done, or just these are early stages, I think, in the resource management and research ends. In addition to the work that is just being initiated in Tampa Bay, there are some collaborative work in Casco Bay in Maine with another sister, one of our national estuary programs, and 2 or 3 other national estuary programs around the United States. So there's Puget Sound is one of them, as Curtis mentioned, in the Pacific Northwest, where quite a bit of work is being done, with the fishery, with the hatcheries, but also with the ambient understanding of the effects of ocean acidification in estuaries. So the national estuary programs overall have a number of initiatives just starting out, though, sort of at the same level that we are here in Tampa Bay, and that is just asking the questions and figuring out how to address those questions at this point.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what we're going to do now is move to a couple of the questions that have come in from the participants, and this one is for each of you. Are there any thoughts on planting seagrass near aquaculture facilities intake valves to bring in lower pH water? I mean, sorry, higher pH water is what he said, higher pH water.
This is Pat. I can answer that.
Okay, please.
Go ahead, Curtis.
No, you first, please.
I mean, I'm real easy. In Georgia, we don't have any submerged aquatic vegetation. So, because of the light penetration on water so turbid, that wouldn't be an issue here.
Right.
In regards to the hatcheries I'm familiar with, that's correct. Some areas don't have a large amount of vegetation based on where they're located, and the locations of hatcheries is a very difficult thing in general, simply from looking at a salinity standpoint and trying to maintain some type of stability. But planting seagrasses outside, no, I don't see that as an option in any place that of the hatcheries I'm aware of. There are many that still use shallow water wells, and those wells, don't work long term, and they have to continually be, adjusted. But and all they do is stabilize the water quality a little bit. It's still, you're still getting the open water constituents funneling down through the sand, 8 or 10 feet. But no, that doesn't. It might be a good idea, but in application, I'm not sure where it would exist, where it would help. The other issue, as in our bay where we pull our water from, we have a large seagrass bed in the bayou that connects to Tampa Bay, and one of our issues is the seagrass beds obviously recede and grow and die off at certain times also. I think they have a net benefit, but at times, they may even cause some of the issues with the water quality.
Thank you for that. Another question is anyone or any of you aware of anyone looking at the effect of ocean acidification on spiny lobster in the Florida Keys?
I'm not.
No,
Okay.
not.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll take one more question from this, and then I think we're going to have to end the webinar. This states, a recognized saturation state in some estuaries of this area is as low as 0.5. What make the mollusk in these estuaries so resistant to the acidic water? Can we draw a conclusion from this and think that some mollusks in the ocean will also evolve to become resistant to ocean acidification just as the estuarine species do?
I can take that. I guess that sounds like sort of a scientific question. Yeah,
Okay.
so there, just in general, there has been some work done looking at the potential for evolution over the next potentially 100 years or so to counteract some of the detrimental effects of ocean acidification. Obviously, that's difficult to do over a 100-year time scale, but a lot of this work has actually been done on phytoplankton that live in, it has generation times of just a few days or so. And the general conclusion has been that yes, evolution does have the potential to mitigate some of the effects of ocean acidification, but usually not completely eliminate it. So, it helps some, but not, it doesn't totally compensate for all there's still some detrimental effects of ocean acidification. So presumably something similar for mollusks. It would depend a lot on their generation time and genetic diversity as to whether they'll have the potential to evolve or not.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that response. And if we didn't get to your questions today about any of the content that you heard, we will give you the emails of the panelists, and you can submit the questions to them. And you can find their email addresses in the chat box in the control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. And if you're interested in joining the SOCAN listserv to learn more about future updates and the Acidification Network, please sign up at the URL shown on the slide. And please direct any questions about SOCAN to socan@SECOORA.org. And I want to thank our panelists again today. That was a very rich discussion, and I think it really shows the possibilities of furthering collaborations and conversations in this area, particularly among different stakeholder groups. So thank you for the time that you put into preparing those presentations and the time that you put into sharing that with us today. And I also want to thank the panelists for continuing to answer any email questions that may come in. And I also want to thank the participants for joining us today. Our next webinar will be similar in format to what you've heard today, but the focus will be on perceptions of ocean acidification as it relates to fisheries in the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina. And we will again hear the same perspectives from the scientific, industry, and natural resource management sectors. We hope that you will participate with us next week. Registration for that webinar and where to send your questions is now available on the SOCAN website at the URL that you see here. So again, thanks to all the panelists for sharing their expertise and perspective, and thanks to all of you for your thoughtful questions and engaging virtual discussion. And thanks for taking the time to join us. We hope to see you at the upcoming virtual panels and webinars. This ends the webinar.